we harness the energy and the excitement that the Democratic Party will need to succeed in November.
So, New Hampshire, I want to thank you. We love you. We're going to be back a lot. We're not going to forget you. You started it. Remember, you started it.
Two impressive political landslides last night in New Hampshire, won by two outsiders who could hardly be more different. I'm Brian Lehrer. Welcome to POTUS 2016, where we follow the presidential horse race and pour cold, hard facts on the overheated campaign rhetoric. Democratic Socialist Bernie Sanders overwhelmed Hillary Clinton Tuesday with 60% of the Democratic vote to her 38%. Billionaire Republican Donald Trump attracted 35% of the GOP vote in a crowded field, which is getting a bit less crowded as Carly Fiorina has dropped out this afternoon, and the AP reports Chris Christie is dropping out too, after a sixth-place finish for Christie. Trump also trounced Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, Jeb Bush, and Ben Carson. Ohio Governor John Kasich came closest with near 16%, only less than half of Trump's total. But how significant is New Hampshire? It was no Super Tuesday or photo finish. Nonetheless, let's take a close look. Yes, time for the horse race. According to exit polling, it was an especially great night for the outsider candidates because primary winners Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump bested fellow candidates in most demographics. On the Republican side, Donald Trump garnered the majority of votes among all ages and incomes, especially those earning under $50,000 a year. He even dispelled theories of a diploma divide, performing well among those who graduated college. Trump also appears to be connecting on ideology, which must have the GOP establishment a little worried. Trump, whose results are highlighted in red at the bottom, did well among Republicans and independents in the state and showed strength across ideological lines, reaping 35% of the very conservative vote and 36% of somewhat conservatives. Among moderates, Trump did show some weakness as 28% of the share went John Kasich's way, but Trump still beat him with 32%. Last night's lukewarm results for Marco Rubio were also good for Trump. The establishment lane is more divided than ever, and there appears to be no end in sight to the circular firing squad of attacks emanating from the camps of Marco Rubio, Jeb Bush, and now John Kasich, who are all battling to be Trump's main rival. And if their donor funding and super PAC backers aren't already on life support, relying on those resources has become less effective. Jeb Bush received just 11% of the New Hampshire electorate after spending a whopping $36 million in the state, while Ted Cruz spent only a little over $500,000, yet took in more votes. In fact, the spending from candidates yielded largely the inverse in primary results. On the Democratic side, it was Bernie Sanders' night. Although he was widely expected to win the state next door to his own, he even scored better than expected among women. According to exit polling from New Hampshire, Sanders pulled 55% of the women voters to Clinton's 44% take. Why? Well, perhaps it's not because Sanders' rallies are where the boys are, as Gloria Steinem suggested the other day, but rather the deeper connection with all kinds of voters that has been important to both parties up to this point. Sanders also won across the board on the issues that matter most to Democratic voters, running the table on health care, the economy, income inequality, and even by a slim 2 percentage points, terrorism. But perhaps the most important exit polling for Sanders was on income, where he pulled in the majority of voters earning less than $200,000 a year. Appealing to poorer voters could be Bernie's bridge to victory in poorer states, as well as states containing the non-white voters Hillary currently polls so well with. All right, time to discuss all this. Joining us, reporter Gabriel Sherman, author of the biography of Fox News President Roger Ailes, the loudest voice in the room, and he's a national affairs editor at New York Magazine. And with us as well, Ian Tuttle, William F. Buckley Fellow in Political Journalism at the National Review Institute. Welcome to both of you. Hi. Ian, let me start with you. I think you've written that the Republican Party is headed toward being a post-Ronald Reagan party. Is that true, even if as they all invoke Reagan as kind of the ideal to strive for?
Well, it's going to depend a whole lot on how this election turns out. If Donald Trump is the nominee, then we're light years away from Ronald Reagan. If it's Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio, then we're certainly within the same sort of the same on the same playing field. The difference is that we now have vocal or visible, I guess, within right-wing politics, because it's not the types of people who are now involved are not necessarily Republican in the traditional sense. We now have a vocal portion of the right-wing vote that is outside of those traditional Republican or conservative lanes, and so the party moving forward is going to have to be responsive to
right-wing but not conservative. What does that mean?
Well, you look at something like the sort of Trump populism. The idea of voters. The traditional planks of conservatism are something like strong on national defense, free enterprise. Fairly traditional Judeo-Christian moral program. Something along those lines, right? The Trump voters are often secular or sort of confused what they think about social issues. They're protectionist. They're generally sort of center-left on social programs like Social Security or welfare or these sorts of things. And on defense, it's sort of a mishmash as well. So they might lean right on certain things without falling into the conservative.
Now, you didn't mention race or religion or identity in general, but let me play the latest Trump outrage clip from just the other night and see how you both think this fits in. Viewers, we're not going to bleep the bad word here, so you can, feel the impact. But if you don't want to be offended, tune out for about a minute and then come back. The point is, in fact, to watch how Trump and the audience not just use the P word for a woman's body part, but revel in it. Watch.
I turn on television. They're chopping people's heads off in the Middle East. If you're Christian, the head comes off. If you're not Christian, the head comes off. We haven't seen stuff like this since medieval times. All right? Medieval times. And people are worried about my tone. You heard the other night at debate. They asked Ted Cruz, serious question, well, what do you think of waterboarding? Is it okay? And honestly, I thought he'd say absolutely, and he didn't. He said, well, it's, he's concerned about the answer because some people, she just said a terrible thing. You know what she said? Shout it out, because I don't want to. Okay, you're not allowed to say, and I never expect to hear that from you again. She said, I never expect to hear that from you again. She said he's a pussy. That's terrible. Terrible.
So, Gabriel, add to that the insult of POWs and Muslims and Mexicans and disabled people and Seventh-day Adventists. He insulted Ben Carson in that way, say, I don't know what that is, Seventh-day Adventist. I'm a Presbyterian. Why didn't all that accumulate to be more objectionable to voters in tolerant New Hampshire?
Well, a couple of reasons. One, we live in a time when there's a vast swath of the electorate that believes that there's a sort of oppressive PC culture. A lot of it comes from, policing on social media and in university culture and on television. And Trump is appealing to that base of voters who really feel like they can't speak what is on their minds, and he is channeling that voice. And so, in fact, the more objectionable his comments are, the better it makes his supporters feel, because they say, look, there is someone up there who has the guts to get up, and I heard this over and over again when I traveled through Iowa and New Hampshire. He's telling it like it is. Now, you could say what he's saying is ridiculous, but he's kind of reaching them on an emotional gut level that they wish that they could speak that way, and he's up there and he's unafraid. So I think, in a certain way, he's repackaged these things not as liabilities but as advantages.
And Democrats will say he's a bigot and his campaign is built on fundamental bigotry, or at least a willingness to express what seemed like bigoted sentiments against Muslims and Mexicans, and to revel in a kind of sexism as we see in that clip. Is that part of the new right wing that might be moderate, as you describe it, on other social issues?
Well, I think to Gabe's point, it's one that feels like it's been silenced or shackled in its speech for a long time. Now, I would say that the Republicans in elected office and in the media have been fairly clear that they don't support anything like that. Paul Ryan came out right after the proposed Muslim ban and said, this isn't Republican politics, this isn't conservatism, and so you're certainly going to have to see those fractures going forward. But it seems to me, to oversell it to say that is the right now or something like that.
Gabriel, you wrote a book about Roger Ailes, Fox News president. How bad do you see the feud right now being between Donald Trump and Fox News over Megyn Kelly and, in general, their handling of that first debate?
Well, Donald Trump has been able to accomplish something that no Republican has in the 20 years that Fox News has been around, which is that he's run a campaign that's been completely independent of any need to play to Fox and to cow to any of their hosts and anchors' interests. And in fact, he's become bigger than the network, and famously he skipped the final debate before Iowa, and now he after the fact said that cost him. But we saw that a week later in New Hampshire, he bounced back and did better than expectations. So he has been able to run a campaign and do things against this kind of official communications arm of the Republican Party, unofficial communications arm of the Republican Party, and not suffer political ruin. And that has never happened before. You've never had a Republican frontrunner for the nomination openly challenge Fox News in the middle of the heat of a campaign.
How do you see the place of Fox News in the Republican Party and I guess even in American political life? You work for another kind of openly conservative news organization. How does it look from the National Review Institute?
Well, as far as television news goes, Fox is obviously dominant among right-leaning viewers. There's no competition, and so they have just an enormous amount of strength in that way. I would say, though, a couple things. One is they're powerfully offset by online media. The Drudge Report and Fox News do not see eye to eye on Trump. And that's very important right now in conservative,
as well as
media circles. Breitbart is exactly the same way. Glenn Beck still holds, and the Blaze still have a lot of influence. There are a number of different
Breitbart and Drudge, pro-Trump, Fox News, and National Review, very explicitly anti-Trump.
Very much so. So I would say there's an offset there. There's also a diversity of opinion among Fox News personalities. Andrea Tantaros, for instance, very openly pro-Trump. Megyn Kelly, not anti-Trump, but certainly fair-minded.
Let's talk about the Democrats. Here is a clip from last night after the results were in. Call this the beginning of the Clinton reset.
When people anywhere in America are held back by injustice, that demands action. That is why I believe so strongly that we have to keep up with every fiber of our being the argument for, the campaign for human rights as women's rights, human rights as gay rights, human rights as worker rights, human rights as voting rights, human rights across the board for every single American.
So, Gabe, she's kind of ticking off the Democratic Party identity groups there.
Yeah.
Gay rights, women's rights, voting rights is code for African American rights.
Yep.
So is that a change for her going forward, or do you see that as the way she's been campaigning?
Well, clearly she's losing on economics. I mean, this Wall Street, the entire final debate before New Hampshire was about Wall Street, and she got crushed by Sanders and this whole Goldman Sachs speaking scandal and the transcripts that have leaked out about what she actually told Goldman Sachs behind closed doors. So she knows that's losing ground if she's fighting on her relationship to the financial industry. So she's now trying to move the ball to a new part of the field, which is that she can be an advocate for groups that have felt disenfranchised. Whether it works, I mean, I sort of see her candidacy as a tragic, through a tragic lens. I mean, even people who love Hillary, Democrats who are very close to her, just say that she's not a very compelling candidate. And, you know, we're seeing a lot of echoes of 2008 all over again. Now, whether Sanders can capitalize on that void, I don't know, but I don't see her fundamentally sort of changing. If she wins, she's going to grind it out, and she's going to kind of win it just by the dint of Sanders having, you know, he's a Democratic socialist, and the Democratic Party might not want to put someone on the ticket.
And we're going to go to South Carolina in a minute and get some input from there. But do you think we put too much stock in what Iowa and New Hampshire mean? These are two very small states population-wise. They don't have many delegates compared to anything that's coming up, really. And, you know, they're small, they're almost all white. What do we really learn about the American electorate from these two votes?
I think you're right. We probably do put too much stock in them, but it's become sort of a feedback loop problem now, that we think New Hampshire and Iowa are really important, so therefore what happens in New Hampshire and Iowa is very important. So as far as this election goes, it's going to matter a whole lot as we move, especially given the fact that on both right and left, I'd say the front runners, you know, Sanders and Trump at this point, are both momentum candidates. They both need sort of that inertia behind them, and when they're impeded, you start to see the bubble deflate.
All right, stay there, both of you, because we're going to bring in some additional evidence from South Carolina. Time for Evidence-Based Politics, where we meet a scholar who has studied an issue oversimplified by campaign rhetoric. The Republican race has been a sprawling field of insiders, outsiders, and other characters. It's narrowing, but on February 20th, South Carolina may predict the eventual nominee. The state chose the Republican candidate who would go on to win the nomination 6 times in a row. The voters did slip up last time, however, in 2012, when they went for Newt Gingrich over Mitt Romney. The first in the South state so far has been polling with Trump ahead, despite its heavy religious culture, and that jab at Trump from South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley in her State of the Union response.
Some people think that you have to be the loudest voice in the room to make a difference. That's just not true. Often the best thing we can do is turn down the volume. When the sound is quieter, you can actually hear what someone else is saying. And that can make a world of difference.
So let us visit South Carolina with Clemson political science professor David Woodard, whose book, The New Southern Politics, reminds us that the South used to be a Democratic haven. Professor Woodard, thanks very much for joining us. Hello from New York.
Thanks for having me.
I see you wrote in a recent piece, the culture of the state remains something different from the Deep South stereotype. So for viewers around the country who might assume that South Carolina is kind of the epitome of the Deep South stereotype in its politics, how is it not?
Ask them who has a African-American senator for the first time since Reconstruction in the Republican Party, a conservative Republican, Tim Scott. That's just one indicator of how things have changed here.
And an Indian-American Republican governor who we just saw.
Exactly.
And Lindsey Graham, for that matter, who as a senator is a big war hawk militarily, but does work across the aisle, very similar to his friend John McCain, which we might not see in senators from, say, Alabama or Mississippi.
Right. But that hasn't really worked well for him in South Carolina, even though it's won him a lot of awards in Washington and probably New York.
So what do you see coming down the pike in the next few weeks? The South Carolina primaries have traditionally been very hard-fought, bare-knuckles affairs.
I think it'll be that way again. I see the cloud on the Republican side is very muddled. It may be very muddled on the Democratic side as well, but I really think that the Republicans, this is a red state, and whoever wins the Republican primary is the one who usually can get the nomination.
There is a strong religious base, evangelical base, as I mentioned in the intro. When we see Governor Haley denounce the idea of always listening to the loudest voice in the room, that was widely taken as a slap at Trump, which she actually confirmed the next day. Right. But does it also apply to Ted Cruz?
It might. It's interesting, she hasn't chosen a candidate. She did before when she worked with Mitt Romney and lost. She may have decided to just sit this one out. I don't think she has a very big audience here in South Carolina. I think the endorsements by Tim Scott and Trey Gowdy of Marco Rubio are probably a little more noteworthy.
Does the Democratic side include a very large percentage of African-American voters? That's been the assumption in the national media. Do you know the numbers?
It's about 60%, we think.
60?
We're polling right now. But the problem that I don't think anybody's picked up on is it's a very small electorate generally. When I say a red state in South Carolina, that means both houses of the state legislature, every elected office, the governor, both senators, and 6 of 7 congressmen are all Republicans. As a result, the Democratic Party is kind of small. That's why I think that somebody like Bernie Sanders could make some real overtures there without having to move a lot of people to still be a strong candidate and oppose her.
What Senator Sanders did this morning coming out of New Hampshire was to go to New York and have breakfast at Sylvia's Soul Food Restaurant in Harlem with Al Sharpton. Do you think that plays in South Carolina?
No. In fact, after the shooting this summer, Al Sharpton was asked not to come. There was a feeling that we should solve this problem ourselves. I think the appeal he'll have to make is eyeball to eyeball with African-American voters that are down in low country of the state.
And the assumption that Hillary Clinton is very popular with African-American voters in the South, is there evidence to back that up in South Carolina?
Certainly in 2008, her husband and her were ahead in this state until Barack Obama came down and beat them in the primary. That was a real turning point for her candidacy to lose to Obama in South Carolina with a large number of African-American voters. But it was the first time we saw that Barack Obama could get a number of white voters as well was in South Carolina.
I think, well, we certainly saw he could do that in Iowa, and I think that established his campaign, but then he was able to do it in the white...
In a state with a large black population.
Yes. You guys have questions for our guest?
I'd like to look at the prospect that Jeb Bush faces in South Carolina. You know, in 2000, his brother, lost to John McCain in New Hampshire and found political resurrection in South Carolina. A lot of people said him and Karl Rove used dirty tricks to sort of push smears about McCain to win. That said, a Bush family name did win South Carolina. Lee Atwater, who was famously his father's political strategist, was a longtime player in South Carolina politics. So what does Jeb face going into South Carolina? You know, he's a moderate, sensible candidate at a time when the base of the party is pretty fired up.
The state has been good to the Bush family twice. In 1988, it came for George H.W. Poppy Bush, and that's one of the things that sent him on to the nomination, not just 2000. But they came in as strong candidates with really only one opponent, and it looks like now there are more opponents, and Jeb Bush hasn't won a primary to be considered a favorite. Mm-hmm. This could be his Waterloo. If he continues to revive, and he might with his brother here, then it could be the turnaround for the whole Bush family. I don't really expect that to happen, but that could happen here.
Ian?
Yeah, Professor, let me ask about the other side of the equation, back to Bernie and Hillary. Bernie's appeal is enormously, I suppose one could say, a class appeal. That there's certainly that. If you look at these New Hampshire exit poll results, Hillary took voters making over 200,000, and Bernie, of course, voters making less. Looking at sort of the socioeconomic breakdown of Democratic voters in the state, does that seem like a better playground for Bernie, given his economic arguments, or for Hillary?
I think it augurs well for Bernie. That doesn't mean that he will be able to make those arguments. 200,000 a year incomes in South Carolina aren't that frequent, so I don't think that's going to roll. But personalities are. And one of the things that I think I've noticed about Bernie Sanders is that he's a very pleasant person on TV, and a lot of people vote for who they like, despite what they may stand for. Again, with a very small electorate, Bernie has a lot of visits to make, and I think he'll make points every time he visits. I'm not sure Hillary can do that.
What do you think is going to happen nationally, Professor Woodard? You have an educated guess?
Well, I think South Carolina will play a role, but I think we're reverting to what you were talking about before you had me on. We're an early primary state. This is a red state. This should be a state that the winner should be in the mainstream of the Republican Party. It was at one time. But I think right now we're kind of in send them a message mode more than let's pick a champion mode. I think that may show up this time.
Professor, thank you very much. And in our last minute or so, I want to mention another name, Michael Bloomberg, who keeps making noise about getting in, and especially if it's Trump versus Sanders or Cruz versus Sanders. How do you see the Michael Bloomberg landscape?
I think if it's Trump versus Sanders, Bloomberg hurts Democrats a lot more than he hurts Republicans, and I would say that is even more true if it's going to be Cruz-Sanders. Then the Republican Party would have a champion to go ahead and rally around.
You work for New York Magazine. Same question.
Oh, I mean, I agree. I think, there's really a lane for him if the two nominees are on the ideological extremes of the party. It gets a lot harder if it's even a Trump-Hillary or Trump or a Cruz-Hillary. So, and I know his advisors are looking at this very closely as we speak. He's told people he's going to make a decision by early March, although I don't know how much more data we're going to have by March 1st for him to make a decision.
That's the problem, isn't it? He has to start by then in order to get on the ballot in all the states, and yet we're not going to have enough data about who's going to win the primary process. So very, very muddled picture as we say goodnight tonight. Thank you both very much. And that is it for POTUS 2016 for today. We're here each week at this hour covering the presidential horse race and pouring cold, hard facts on the overheated campaign rhetoric. The next Democratic debate, Hillary versus Bernie, is tomorrow, Thursday, February 11th at 9 p.m. Eastern on both PBS and CNN. The Republicans debate again on Saturday. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.